The issue of climate change remains divisive, inflammatory, and controversial. Today, I'd like to explore how Christians can make sense of and speak meaningfully into the environment debate without being mired in the climate wars. Is there a Christian position to be found, or is there more to the answer than just picking a side? The Christian response on this issue has been reduced to one of 3 points: a call to stewardship of the environment, or a call to protect jobs and people in the short term, or a call to submit to God's sovereignty in the long term. Alone, each of these calls is problematic. However, each is valid. They are not incorrect, but they are incomplete. And putting together a biblically faithful and cohesive theology of energy security and environmental stewardship requires some deeper thinking, and importantly, some more nuanced thinking. Sadly, nuance is not something we see a lot of in relation to the public debate and discourse around environmental issues today. Even the phrase climate change can be quite triggering to people across the political spectrum. But I think it's possible to rise above the bitterness, the myopic thinking, and the blinding outrage that's taken up far too much of our airwaves on this issue. It's been said that the best definition of tyranny is the removal of nuance. I couldn't agree more. Of course, I'm not pretending that this short session will offer an exclusive or an exhaustive catalogue on the issues and how to navigate them, but I do hope to set down a framework through which to think about these issues. A framework that is faithful to the Bible, whilst being simultaneously relevant to both the challenges that we all face and to the debate that we are trying to have. With this in mind, I'd like to talk about 3 things. First, it is about the environment, but it's not just about the environment. Secondly, it is about God's sovereignty, but it's not just about God's sovereignty. And thirdly, it's not easy, but it's not hopeless. First then, it is about the environment, but it's not just about the environment. In our post-truth world, we are all increasingly being encouraged and conditioned, both consciously and subconsciously, to lead with our feelings. Our feelings, so we are told, come first, and they should be the primary means through which we understand the world and decide what's right and wrong with it. This becomes both unworkable but also contradictory, because on issues of climate change and environmental health, some voices in the debate, from all sides of the debate, proclaim their position with such moral righteousness and sanctimony that they reveal a clear understanding of the existence of absolute moral truth. There is good and evil, there is right and wrong, and I'm going to tell you what it is, so they say. Social psychologist Jeganathan explores aspects of this in his work on moral foundations theory. Haidt talks about how we tend to hold our moral views instinctually and then try to find ways to rationalise, defend, and communicate those views. It's not so much a world without moral truth that we live in, but a world in which we're all pretty convinced that there is moral right and wrong, and we are the ones that are morally right. Our moral reasoning then is really about rationalising how we feel about what is right and what is wrong. Of course, healthy moral discourse relies on people believing that what they believe is correct is correct. However, what seems to have changed in recent times, and is given very clear expression through the climate wars, is the moralising of difference to the point of contempt. There's a Netflix drama called What If, in which Renee Zellweger plays a billionaire sociopath. She uses extortion, blackmail, and all manner of other manipulative techniques to get what she wants. In modern moral terms, she follows her feelings and desires pretty faithfully, without much regard for anyone else. There's a telling line in the drama where Zellweger's character declares, "Do you know what I hate the most? Having to deal with the moral ideas of lesser people." It exemplifies the sad but growing reality that we don't just think less of opinions that we disagree with, but we think less of the people who hold those opinions. At worst, we dehumanize them. We think of them as lesser people. All of this turns us inward. We're less and less properly engaged with the debates out there because so much of our thinking and our energy is focused on how much we dislike the people on the other side of the debate rather than the debate itself. Those who raise reasonable questions about the potentially damaging impacts of and action on climate change that could affect jobs and energy security should not be dismissed as unintelligent or as climate deniers, as they all too often are. Similarly, those who advocate for governmental and other action to ensure a healthier environment and a shift to energy sources that are less damaging should not be labelled climate alarmists or extremists, as they all too often are. As is the case with any debate, there will always be extreme views put forward. For most of us, the challenge will be to strain away the anger, vitriol, and nonsense from the reasonable concerns out there, and move forward in a way that acknowledges and speaks to the lived reality of the vast majority of people who live on planet Earth. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but there's an ancient prophet who wrote a book of the Old Testament that speaks to some of these dynamics powerfully. Amos, the shepherd prophet, powerfully writes that Israel's calls for justice had turned bitter. In another translation, he uses the word wormwood, which referred to a bitter substance derived from plants of a particular species. It was a powerful symbol of poison, bitterness, and sorrow. Amos's point is that when we call for justice, when we call for action from a place of anger and bitterness, even if we get what we want, we will still be left with division and anger and bitterness. According to Amos, at least, our calls for change must come from a better place, from a place of redemption and restoration rather than retribution. In our hearts, we must seek the betterment of all, not just the defeat of our opponents. And how does Amos drill into this? By diagnosing the reason for bitterness as being an absence of righteousness. Before he condemns bitter calls for justice, he points to their cause. You have thrown righteousness to the ground, he says. Now today, righteousness is not a particularly nice word. It's often tied up with notions of self-righteousness, pride, and sanctimony. But in the Bible, righteousness is more relational. In fact, according to the Christian message, righteousness comes only through a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Righteousness is about being right with God and being right with other people. Funneling Amos into 21st century climate debates offers a challenging but helpful way forward. Christians are called to understand this debate and engage with this debate with two very important categories of relationship, taking priority as our moral backdrop: being in right relationship with God and being in right relationship with other people. Of course, practically, there are plenty involved in environmental debates that we have no relationship with at all. But that's not what Amos is talking about here, nor is it what Jesus was talking about when he called on people to love their neighbours as themselves. It's about a gracious, compassionate, non-bitter and loving posture of the heart and the mind. This is what offers us a basis for avoiding what is sadly too often the case in relation to these debates: the folly of being disagreeable when we disagree. The bitterness of focusing on the people that hold opposing views, rather than on the battle of ideas through which we need to move forward together. It is about the environment, but it's not just about the environment either. We need to first see God and other people through a frame of dignity and love. Secondly, we need to understand that it is about God's sovereignty, but it's not just about God's sovereignty. The idea that it doesn't really matter what we do to our environment because God's in control anyway doesn't hold water theologically or practically. Yes, it's very clear from the Bible that God is sovereign. He has ultimate control and power over our physical world. But it's also very clear from the Bible that God endows humankind with special agency, choices, and responsibilities. It is only God ultimately that can restore our broken world, but He's invited us to do that in partnership with Him. According to the Christian message, the universe that God created is a moral universe. And one of the most powerful ways that God expressed that truth was by creating us as moral beings with moral agency. This moral agency applies to every aspect of stewardship to which He has called people. Most obviously and importantly, how we treat Him, how we treat one another, and how we treat His creation, our environment. In addition to this stewardship imperative, there is also a justice imperative. And it comes from the simple reality that those most affected by environmental degradation are the most vulnerable. Poorer nations, low-lying communities, and vulnerable communities have the lowest levels of capacity to mitigate against challenging environmental changes, and the highest levels of likeliness that they will suffer under such changes. We've already seen examples of this with leaders from relatively poor island nations coming together to call on wealthier industrial nations to do more to tackle climate change. With this in mind, it might also help to think about action on climate change as a logical hedge against the ostensible body of science out there. Even if the science on climate change itself isn't accepted by everyone, we know empirically that the burning of fossil fuels is not good. It emits bad things. They're often called negative externalities. It's also finite, and it beholds us to unbiblical value systems that stand opposed to Christianity, totalitarian regimes who control fossil fuel energy supplies. Perhaps even more simply, we know that breathing in what fossil fuels breathe out is not good for us, and there's no question from anyone around the science of that. So it seems that energy security and energy self-sufficiency is not just good economics, it's good theology too. In the significant book Theology and Ecology Across the Disciplines on Care for Our Common Home, edited by Celia Dean Drummond and Rebecca Artinian Kaiser, the intersection between theology and ecology is explored. The book highlights the importance of engaging various disciplines and fostering a broad commitment across political views and academic fields to seriously address the biblical call to care for both one another and for our environment. Significantly, this book was inspired, at least in part, by Pope Francis's work Laudato Si, in which the Pope makes the case for thinking of our environment as a common home. Of course, none of these are new ideas, but perhaps they need to be re-articulated in a way that both sides of the climate debates can meaningfully engage with. Yes, God is sovereign, but this issue and the ways in which it calls on each of us is about more than God's sovereignty. It's about our agency and responsibility as well. Thirdly and finally, it's not easy, but that doesn't mean that it's hopeless. The seminal psychologist Erik Erikson wrote of the 8 stages of psychosocial development. The first is the ability to trust. It's a stage that most people go through in the first 18 to 24 months of their lives. It's why a baby cries, because it doesn't know whether or not it can trust that its needs are going to be met. Its needs for milk, warmth, contact, food, and provision. But as it grows, if it is provided for, it begins to trust. The flip side of trust, as Erikson and others have conceived of it, is hope. We trust that things are going to get better. Indian Nobel Literature laureate Rabindranath Tagore famously wrote that hope is the bird that sings when the dawn is still dark. Hope is the confident expectation of something better that is coming. But hoping for something is not enough. The object of our hope needs to be supported by the subject of our hope. That is to say, what are we putting our hopes in to bring about what we hope for? The subject of our hope needs to be hope-worthy. Otherwise, our hopes will be empty. God's sovereignty and our partnership with God give us all the hope we need to tackle even the most seemingly intractable challenges, including climate change. Part of the challenge of the climate debates today is that people come to and hold their opinions based on what they're hoping for. That's not a problem in and of itself. However, according to the Christian vision of hope, wanting things to get better is not enough. Having a true, meaningful, and practical pathway to things getting better is just as important. Otherwise, our hope can be misplaced. Put another way, having something or someone to hope in is just as important as having something to hope for. And this is where the Christian message becomes more than just explanatorily powerful. It becomes transformatively beautiful. I've just spoken of the importance of understanding and accepting that we have a responsibility to care for our environment, and that the Bible affirms that with creation stewardship as a central call that God gives to humankind. However, from God's perspective, that call is not a set and forget task. The term creation stewardship is the idea that God made people above other things he made, with a special status and a special place in his creation. Part of the responsibility that comes with that special status is to care for his creation. However, God doesn't outsource creation stewardship to people. He invites people into it in partnership with him. He remains active, present, and involved. He shows this in countless ways, but most importantly and most powerfully, he demonstrates it by stepping into the world as a person in human history, Jesus Christ. God coming into the world as a person speaks not just to the climate debates, but to all of the seemingly intractable challenges we have. It shows us that even though we have challenges that seem insurmountable, if we are willing to tackle them in a spirit of nuance, graciousness, and thoughtfulness, he will work with us. The Bible doesn't set down a policy response or regulatory framework for guaranteeing a healthy environment, but it does set down the principles that we need. One of those principles is embracing and embodying a spirit of hope that's anchored in a sovereign God and expressed in how we deal with each other, especially how we deal with people with whom we disagree. What we actually end up doing in relation to climate change and energy security is not the most important question. It's preceded by at least 3 principles that Christians are invited to embrace amid the all too heated vitriol of much of the debate. Firstly, assuming a gracious heart posture towards others in the debate, accepting the reality that there are valid questions asked and points made on almost all sides of the debate. Secondly, embracing the responsibility to do what we can to care for and maintain a healthy environment, a responsibility that flows from the biblical ideas of stewardship and care for the most vulnerable. And thirdly, anchoring our hope not in governments, policy solutions, or even each other, but doing what we can through all of those things, while anchoring ultimate hope in a God who is sovereign but invites us to work with him to make our world a better place. Of course, the nature of the challenge is such that governments, policy solutions, and other institutions are going to play an important role. But it is not in them that our hope should ultimately rest.